After being a good example of how literary criticism is not a very desired niche, this question came to mind. Is what I'm doing a waste of time? Is reading fiction cumbersome? Well, there's a point. Hear me out. Imagine you're having a party, and some of the guests are comedians, some are foodies, some are adventurers, some are scientists, some are magicians, etc., and someone is a writer or a critic. Of all these people, it is very difficult, maybe impossible, to find something that will make this person stand out and be the focus of everyone's attention. So it can only be of interest to a certain minority. YouTube is that party. Actually, this analogy only sheds light on the rational side of this party. There are also reaction channels that pretend to practice one-page descriptions from an author's 1,000-page book, some of which have even become millionaires. When the target audience is a very, very small minority, and by way of illustration, in a bohemian decorated house where all the windows are closed, one of the person philosophizing reading is this that can elevate him or her to the position of the highly intelligent person in the room. And in other cases, this can be mitigated by the fact that he or she is just a nerd. Whereas in this case, the person can even turn into a mysterious identity, a charismatic personality. And this is not because of what it offers, but because of the expectation it creates. Indeed, literature does not directly offer you anything visual or actional. As such, it can be labeled as a useless field of art. But this and everything else is just perspective. For an example, what is telepathy? The ability to read the human mind. What is reading human life? Ironically, it's just a boring academic pursuit when it should be a higher faculty than reading the human mind. Technology has enabled us to have this ability, but for humanity, whose imagination is faster and more advanced than the progress of life, what has been achieved is always the worst alternative to what is desired. Literature takes this faculty and gives it a superpower, the ability to describe human life by reading its mind. This is the power of literature, and only literature can provide it. Not even cinema is visionarily capable of this power. It may be an indisputable fact that non-fiction books are useful because they are written with the promise of being useful. But isn't reading fiction a waste of time? In today's age, what's the point of reading Anna Karenina? What those who ask this question fail to realize is that he himself is a product of life to be read, and that he is the embodiment of fictional characters. A writer can say more about the character he has created than he can say about himself, and while making prejudiced comments out of pride about himself, he can present his character to us brutally naked, and present a whole life in a book like a prophecy, unlike his own life, which he cannot know a minute later. A fictional character is an oracle born in the human imagination, and these characters can become superior to the author, who is the god of the world they inhabit, and they can bring more to the author and to us than the author brings to them, and we can attribute to ourselves the achievements of the character who is capable of so much more than we are. Because reading is at the same time vocalizing what is written and feeling as if we have lived the story ourselves. Reading can bring you to a life experience that you would spend 10 years on in 1 second, and after 1 minute it makes you believe that you have lived those 10 years. And only fiction books can do this, because to build the foundation of this magic, you have to build a fiction. If we see ourselves in a fictional character, it shows us a part of ourselves that we cannot see in a normal mirror, but it does not stick this part to our identity as if it will never change, because in any other objective, this part is not ours. In the literature, where an anarchist principle applies, it is essential to always leave an enigma. Cinema adapts this enigma. The book describes the character's state of mind, and the cinema shows us that it uncovers nothing. So while non-fiction provides a broader intellectual resource, fiction books provide a deeper one. What about audiobooks? Audiobooks are technology's way of saving literature from becoming a moldy treasure. The only disadvantage of audiobooks is that they don't have the freedom and efficiency of analysis of written books, and this disadvantage will not change as long as writing exists because of the evolutionary conditioning of humans to favor writing. In an age in which reading makes tsundoku look prestigious, audiobooks are like Black Friday. It offers a narrative plane that is faster than the written book can offer, but less and more superficial and potentially decontextualized if you have ADHD. Because in the written book, you can turn the page, whereas in the audiobook, you can only be spawned on a random word in a paragraph. So if you really want to read a book, it is still the case that even an audiobook is not an equivalent reading tool to a written book. For the moment, the audiobook is to the written book what ChatGPT is to programmers, and it contributes to the same same thing that ChatGPT contributes to programmers: shallowness, lack of tacit knowledge. Very mimics of reading as seen on social media are no different than being an intellectual commodification bouncer, posing with a book in hand only to be reduced to a pastiche manner. As the act of reading increases, its content has become shallower. The reading person phenomenon has been idealized, and the inference derived from the act of reading has been reduced to presenting external reactions to the act of reading. At the moment, everyone is reading, but no one does. Even worse, everyone quote-unquote writes, and no one reads. It is because no one reads to you. Someone who sees reading as a finish line cannot hope to gain anything from the act of reading, as he or she has demarcated what lies ahead. It must be recognized that reading is never a final result. Understand that reading is always a stage of writing, and it remains so unless it leads to life-changing action. This stage is often impassable because life is pragmatically too dull to grind down the imagination that is put into writing. The metaphor that we overlook because of the dominance of the symbolism of an artistic and industrial fiction of writing is that we are all obliged to be writers. If you were to say, "But I don't want to be a writer," you absurdly do. In every action you take and every decision you make, you base your reading on life and daydream about your supposed writing, which will get you disappointed the next morning. That's because you poison the text, any object positioned to read, by thinking about the effect of this act of reading and what it will transfer to the writing, and not paying attention to what is designed in supposed writing while filling the writing with what is desired in the design, resulting in a text containing shallowness rather than authenticity. Blank pages, the building block of writing, cannot be a tool for the writer's daily preoccupations, because writing is a monastery that requires autonomy and discipline. And this monastery needs to be crafted and internalized. Just as the monastery looks the same and deepless to everyone from the outside, the blank pages that are not internalized and that are filled with memorization like an autodidact will continue to appear as blank pages. The act of writing does not complete the blank page. The text uses the blank page. Even after you write something on a page, there will continue to be hundreds of blank pages on the following pages. This provides the right environment for you to exhibit a thought that is autonomous from the previous one, or to continue a thought unaffected by returning to the previous one in all its purity. The serenity and simplicity of a blank page allows the mind to be relatively clearer and more talkative. Social media has degenerated this possibility and, ironically enough, turned the blank page into a compelling nuisance because of its simplicity. I know you've already heard this 1,000 times, but the thing to do is to get away from the internet, which always offers you something, and retreat for a while to the monastery of the blank page, which offers you nothing. But before scribbling on this blank page, you need to know what it means to read, because perhaps despite all the things you will do to get you reading or writing a certain object, your final result will always remain watching. If a book does not add anything to you, your action is not reading a book, but watching a book. Every fiction writer has some exaggerated, non-existing, superficial features in their books, because you can't just write life. If you were to try, you would have failed because you attributed a fixed personality design to an ever-changing life scheme, which, together with the limits that emerged from environmental and sociological factors, took the book away from its intended purpose. To take an example from the famous writer Franz Kafka, no matter how radical this claim may seem, Kafkaesque writing style is not Kafka's originality, but his fear. As with anything driven by efficiency and fluidity, momentum is your killer, and with momentum you'll have a book that continues where it started and is prone to deflate like an overinflated tire on a bicycle. And when it breaks, it must either be tightened from exhaustion or expanded from intensity, and as a result, you'll have a book worn out due to the lack of control of the brake pad between sentences. After a while, no matter how many new things that are meant to say, the writer cannot wear the same shoes for 10 years, and cannot produce different sounds from the same instrument, and cannot get the same pleasure from the same food again and again. A lonely writer cannot really write a book. He would only be writing noise. A successful book has more than one author. The books that most honestly describe loneliness are the least successful ones. Loneliness is not an experience. It is elimination. Those who talk about loneliness with fancy descriptions get drunk to compensate for the pain of loneliness. Their writings are their refuge, and they isolate themselves with it. For the writer whose comfort zone is writing, identity is a lifelong consolation that won the lottery. This consolation shields the fear of change and feeds loneliness. It creates survivorship bias, and the person looks for original bricks to his consolated life. If you preserve your current mindset while wanting to change your life, you'll only be able to watch between the pages nearing the end. An example of a syllogism that refutes one's potential is reading a book in its original language versus reading it in translation. Reading a book in translation is not a deficiency, it is a difference, and this difference contains a richness that is more internalized in the way one has mastered it. In every language, words carry a different meaning and are a psychosocial reading of the audiences in which that language is spoken. Hufu, or some word in Japanese, means nothing to a Turkish speaker, but the corresponding translation inevitably has a distinct and personal meaning. The emphasis on personal is particularly important because it implies that there is a disadvantage to reading a book in its original language, whereas there is no disadvantage to reading a book in translation, except as a personal choice. Reading a book in its original language and yet being unfamiliar with that language deprives us of meanings. Strengthened by personal experience, keeps us away from the act of reading by depriving us of mastering the language we are unfamiliar with, and by requiring us to construct meaning from the language we are familiar with in order to master said language. Learning a foreign language is by definition impossible as long as it remains a foreign language. What we expect from a book or any reading is either to learn or to know, but as a filter we must first master the distinction between learning and knowing, between new and foreign. Learning is an action that we all commonly misunderstand and therefore end up disappointed and looking for something lacking in ourselves. Especially when it comes to languages, all the headlines that promise you beautiful dreams say learning a language. I bet I can teach you 10 languages in just 1 hour. It's too easy to learn. 2 + 2 = 4. Yay! You've learned. But if you want to be a mathematician, the next step is analysis, investigation, calculation, in short, study, and this discipline works the same in every field. You have to work on what you have learned in order to be able to say that you really know it. Only after going through these stages does the foreign become new to you. Books become a mystery you harbor rather than a mystery you accumulate. Having learned this distinction and having understood the importance of reading, I have one last piece of advice. I know your attention span is shorter than the Lilliputians in Gulliver's Travels, so without further ado, this is my last 2 cents. I'm going broke. The best advice I can give for effective reading is not to read. You knew this was coming. Every book contains the imposition of the author's truth, and every author contradicts every other author. If, as a reader, you try to read all authors, well, you're clueless. If you eat too much food, you either throw up or you create a heaviness that you expect to throw up. Reading is the same way. What someone who reads too much retains in his next reading is the view of a particular author as opposed to his own, and through this lens the reader protects that author's castle instead of tearing it down and expanding his horizons. Contrary to popular belief, to broaden one's horizons is not to read thousands of books, but to understand a few. There are scholars who devote their entire career to the analogy of a one singular philosopher. You think they could have been done better? What is better, satisfied or climaxed? I still cannot say with confidence that I have read even one book, but I can easily argue that the rules I have adopted will be a good guide. Don't rush and get carried away by your ego. You'll probably be as ignorant for another 20 years. We realize the importance of intellectualism when 55 years old Socrates acknowledged how ignorant he was. You gotta be proud.